going into Genesis chapter 15. In my estimation, this might be one of the more poignant and important passages in our whole Bible. If you've read it this week, I hope you have, or you're probably familiar with it. We will read this and then dive into some discussion of this section. There's a lot of really, really powerful stuff here. Genesis chapter 15, verses 1 through 20. It says, "After these events, the word of Yeshua came to Abram in a vision, saying, 'Do not be afraid, Abraham. I am your shield. Your reward is exceedingly great.' And Abram said, 'Master Yeshua, what would you give me, seeing as I go childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus?' And Abram said, 'Behold, you have given me no seed, and behold, one born in my house is my heir.' And behold, the word of Yeshua came to him, saying, 'This one is not your heir, but he who comes from your own body is your heir.' And he brought him outside and said, 'Look now towards the heavens, and count the stars, if you are able to count them.' And he said to him, 'So are your seed.' And he believed Yeshua, and he reckoned it to him for righteousness. And he said to him, 'I am Yeshua, who brought you out of Ur-Kasdim, to give you this land to inherit it.' And he said, 'Master Yeshua, whereby do I know that I possess it?' And he said to him, 'Bring me a 3-year-old cow, and a 3-year-old goat, and a 3-year-old ram, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon.' And he took all these to him, and cut them in the middle, and placed each half opposite the other, but he did not cut the birds. And the birds of prey came down on the carcasses, and Abram drove them away. And it came to be, when the sun was going down, and a deep sleep fell upon Abram, that behold, a frightening great darkness fell upon him. And he said to Abram, 'Know for certain that your seed are to be sojourners in a land that is not theirs, and shall serve them, and they shall afflict them 400 years. But the nation whom they serve I am going to judge, and afterward let them come out with great possessions. Now as for you, you are to go to your fathers in peace. You are to be buried at a good old age. Then in the 4th generation they shall return here, for the crookedness of the Amorites is not yet complete.' And it came to be, when the sun went down and it was dark, that behold, a smoking oven and a burning torch passing between those pieces. On the same day Yeshua made a covenant with Abram, saying, 'I have given this land to your seed, from the river of Mitzrayim to the great river, the river Euphrates, with the Kenite, and the Kenizzite, and the Cadmonite, and the Hittite, and the Perizzite, and the Rephaim, and the Amorite, and the Canaanite, and the Girgashite, and the Jebusite.'" So there you have it. That is chapter 15. Now it seems fairly straightforward on the surface, but as you know, looks can be deceiving. There is a lot buried in these depths. I'm fairly confident about this. So let's take a look at just breaking this down a little bit at a time and kind of just take it line by line. First thing I want to bring to your attention is that this is the second mention in the Bible of the word fear. Yara or Yare. Now this is the first time this is the first time that it is put in the context of "you shall not fear," do not fear. Abram, do not fear. Does anyone remember when the first time that the word Yara or Yare appeared in the Bible?
Chapter 3.
Yes. In relation to what?
When they feared that they were naked.
Yes. Exactly. They discovered that they were naked and they were afraid. Now, knowing that, does that suggest to you, in your mind at least, in some way, that there's any kind of connection between Adam and Eve being naked and afraid, or afraid because they were naked, and Abram being told not to fear? Is there any connection that you can see?
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. I didn't think about that. But, well, I mean, they were to never know what sin was, right? Had they never eaten of that tree, they would have had no fear. And God is now revealing himself to Abraham, and he's telling him not to fear.
Yeah. Yeah, I absolutely think that that's a key insight, that somehow thinking about the first and second mention of fear and seeing under what circumstances it's relating to fear, you can kind of draw some interesting parallels. I think obviously Adam and Eve were afraid of their exposure. They felt exposed. And Abram, I think, it kind of occurred to me, why would God be telling him not to be afraid? What do you think he would be afraid of? Do we have anything that he seems to be afraid of, or something in the story that would lead us to believe that he was afraid of something?
Yes, 2 times he's fearful, right? Also in the middle when he falls into a deep sleep.
Now that is something to be afraid of. Yes. I mean, he goes into a deep darkness, and yeah, that's a pretty powerful thing there. We'll get to that in a minute. But I mean, just based on the context of what's happened in his life so far, what you know about him, what do you think he might be afraid of?
Not having an heir?
Yes, I think that is the way that Abram is feeling exposed and naked.
Well, he's mentioning that this is like a vision, right? And he's telling him, I'm your shield.
Right.
So, I mean, that's like his word of comfort there, right?
Right.
So Abraham, like you said, might be feeling pretty exposed.
Yeah. I think, interestingly, that some of the rabbinic works that I looked at this week suggested that maybe Abram was afraid of retaliation by those 4 kings that he just beat the tar out of in the previous chapter. That maybe he was afraid that they were, some form of retribution was going to come back on him, that they would regather their armies and come after him. That might have been part of the reason that he was afraid. But that doesn't seem legitimate. It could certainly be, but it doesn't seem quite as poignant in his mind as what he brings up here twice. I got no children. I think we kind of overlook the significance of that, because in our day, there are people who just choose to not have any children. I've met plenty of people, Chris's age, who just never had any children in their lives, and they're perfectly happy with that. But that would have been not so in much of the history of the world. That children were a powerful thing, an incredible blessing, and for a reason too, which I think we'll discuss in a moment. But I think that children are like a security in those days. And, they didn't have Social Security. There's no safety net. There's no welfare system. I think that's why God places so much importance and significance on taking care of widows and orphans, because that is God's Social Security system, is for families to take care of families, and B, for us to take care of widows and orphans if we happen upon them and they need our help. So Abram is essentially seems to be saying, God, what is my reward is great. It's like my reward. I'm already rich. I have a lot of stuff. The problem is I don't have anybody to leave it to, and I'm getting old. And that I have no legacy, no progeny, nothing to carry on my name, nothing to carry on my mission. I mean, do you feel like you get the sense that Abram's on a mission? I certainly do. He's in the mission field, as it were. He's making souls. If you remember, when we first were introduced to Abram, he was leaving his homeland and with the souls that he had made. So he's already, converting people from idolatrous worship to the worship of the one true God. And it certainly seems to me from what we know about Eliezer, coming up in later chapters, that Eliezer is also a follower of God. But there seems to be a bit of testing, him testing God, in his own exploits. But Abram certainly seems terribly concerned about the children thing. And that is, I think, the root of his fear, is that he's exposed without heirs. And, we've talked many times about fear. And, I talked with the kids actually this week again about this topic because it came up in our own study. In fact, it was in relation to the first mention of fear in the Bible, and that story with Adam and Eve. And began to discuss with them regarding, what is fear? Well, fear is really discomfort or disquietedness in our brains that arises from uncertainty. Uncertainty causes fear. And it is absolutely the opposite of faith, because we're supposed to have certainty regarding the things that we have been told in our scriptures and understand them with having absolute certainty in our minds. And when we get wrapped around the axle with feeling uncomfortable with uncertainties that are happening all around us, it causes us to become afraid. And we are not really allowed to do that. There's so many times in the Bible when it tells us don't do that. And I know that each of us, that is a struggle for most of us. Most people that I'm aware of and have talked to about various things in life, and especially religious type stuff, we're all afraid. And I think it's partly a symptom of the age that we live in. It's very uncertain in and of itself. But I think, I'll tell you that this year so far has been I would say, the year of faith for me, learning a lot more about what is biblical faith and what does it mean, and trying to work that out in my mind and learning to get rid of fear and really discover what faith is. It's a big challenge, and I think we all are going to face that at some point or another. Our fear regarding death, our fear regarding money, our fear about getting old, or our health going away, or the fear about our children, our fear about one of the things that occurred to me, and I think I was telling Angela about this the other day, is I think that a certain fear has gripped America as a nation, which has not previously been so prominent. Of course, I'm fairly young, but, I think that we have, all of us, been raised with the idea that America is a fabulous place. It's the land of the free and the home of the brave, and, it's got all of this glowing promise, and that it would just go on forever, and everything's great, and we'll always overcome evil, and it's got a majority of good, down-home, God-fearing, apple pie, baseball-loving people, that everything's going to be all right. But, the events of the past couple of years have really, I think, shaken a lot of people's faith that they had in America. And that you kind of watch the news nowadays, and I don't know about you guys, but I'm a pretty conservative fella when it comes to the political spectrum. And I look at what's happening with our president and the media and the way the country's going. It just seems to be coming apart at the seams altogether. It's just lawlessness and wickedness, and people rioting in the streets, and politicians just lying, and it seems like the whole thing is coming unzipped at the seams. And that maybe that faith that we all had in America has been misplaced, and perhaps even an idol in our lives, that we've placed our trust in America to be the world's policeman, to right wrongs and avenge evils. And maybe for a long time we may have had that role, and we performed it as well as we could, not always with admirable composure, and maybe we made some errors, but I think that overall we did fairly well for the world, and we had good intentions, and we wanted to help people and stop evil people from killing other people, and we had a decent track record of trying to help the world. But I don't know if that's true anymore. And I think a lot of people are losing faith in the country. And I think, perhaps, for good reason, that God is maybe just exactly like when he visited his people in Egypt and they were in slavery and he was taking them out and about to redeem them to take them to the promised land, that he had to destroy the gods of Egypt to get his people to even relinquish their hold that they had on the gods of Egypt. And yes?
I was thinking, may we not be wandering in the wilderness saying, why'd you take us out of here?
Yes. I could very easily see us, wandering through the wilderness going, man, I used to have an iPod and I had an iPad and I could sit at my desk. And remember when we used to go out to dinner? And I could very easily see us wandering through the wilderness. We're reminiscing about all the great things that America used to be like and all the things we had in America. And it's like, oh, goodness. Yeah, Facebook. So, I mean, I just jotted down a couple of ideas here about things that we get to fearing about that can become an idol in our lives, and that we are definitely not to fear. And the United States actually just really began to play upon my mind and think, we have, all of us, put a lot of faith in this country. And I think it's still, I think, the greatest country on the earth. I really do. Sorry, John. The Netherlands is a fine place, but, I mean, your own country has changed a lot in the last, few years. And so
not spiritual.
Sure.
Is it getting worse and
Yeah.
worse?
It's nothing new it's not some kind of weird anomaly. It seems to be happening all over the place in all different countries. That's not nearly as religious as it used to be, and I don't know, but I can see that people might hold on to the ideal of America and what it maybe could have been or once was, but that it's creating a lot of uncertainty for people, looking at what's happening to America and going, wow, this is really getting kind of scary. Our country is not what it used to be. Well, let's make sure that we're not placing our hope in this country, because I look at it now and I go, this is not worthy of placing my trust in this place. The way it's going now, you do not want to trust these people.
It's interesting, though, at the same time that all of this is going down, that this has become more unlocked for a lot of us.
I agree. And it seems like you're right. There is a remnant, I think, of people in this country and every country that are really getting serious about, the Bible and what it says and what it means for their lives. And I think that that's just exactly what the prophecies talk about. People turning back to the fathers, and those are your end time believers. As far as I can tell, those are your faithful remnant. But
many atheists.
Yeah,
scientists that eventually come to the conclusion, hey, there must be more.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
Angie, what do you think about this word fear in the picture, the Hebrew letter picture from this one?
How's it spelled?
It's Yare, right? It's Yod Resh Aleph. What do you make of that as a word picture for this symbol?
So the yod is like a hand or work.
It's like a work, and the resh is like
head. And
And then Allah.
Aleph is.
I think you're gonna, whatever you fear becomes your idol. And so hopefully what you fear is the Aleph.
But it's also interesting that it's always the opposite. One way it's fear, and of course it also means morality to revere. So that's almost the opposite. But of course, do you fear in reverence, or is it reverence? And of course here it is clearly fear. Mm-hmm. But sometimes it's being used, you should fear Yahuwah.
Right.
And then I think could it be that means more like refer and, you know, to
Yeah, I
know
think that in
faith
the
that he is
right.
the morality.
in a positive connotation, yes, you would render it a godly fear would be more referred to as like a reverence, a respect, an honor that is paid. Yeah, I think that if your life is ruled by a desire to not displease your Father in heaven, or if you have a fear of punishment from your Father in heaven, I think that needs to be balanced, because if you maybe are constantly fearing that God is going to squash you like a bug, that's not a great sense to have, and maybe you need to review what Jesus has done to take away your sins, and that maybe, you know, come to grips with how God actually sees you. Because I know that I dealt with that, you know, for years ago. It was always on my mind, you know, about, man, this God is serious and powerful, and he's not messing around, you know. And I it kind of is frightening to realize that, like Jonathan Edwards used to preach during the Puritan days, you know, sinners in the hands of an angry God, you know. To an extent, we need to have that sense of fear, but it can get overwhelming, where you don't feel like you're worthy. And yeah, you've got to have a sense of that I'm not worthy, and thank you for, you know, accepting me in spite of my unworthiness. But it has to be balanced with a healthy respect and a desire to please Father and not to displease Him, balanced with a holy terror of this powerful God that will just squish you like a bug. So, yes.
If you look at that backwards, it's the power that leads your actions.
Mm.
You've olive power, the head, action, the hand. And so, fearing the wrong thing, you know, when people are afraid, they do really stupid things.
Yeah, absolutely.
But if you're fearing God, I think then you're doing the wise things. So
Yeah.
whatever that is that I don't think you can fear too.
Well, that's why the scriptures say the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. You can't kind of go wrong by fearing God. Even if it's an unhealthy fear, I think you could go wrong, but not nearly as wrong as if you were fearing something else. But I think that's a good play on that word picture there. What did you say again?
The power that guides your actions.
The power that guides your actions. That's a good way to look at it. You know, think about the power that guides your reaction in regards to these things. Money. That guides a lot of people. Your health. You know how powerful that is in this country. I think we have like the cult of fountain of youth or something. I'm serious. I think that our reliance upon our healthcare system, and, you know, thinking that I've got to have insurance, they think of it as assurance instead of insurance. They think that somehow the government needs to help me. I need to make sure that I have everything
At some
covered.
point, people started talking about it like if you didn't have health insurance, you were going to die.
Yeah.
But if you had it, you wouldn't.
Right.
And I was like, do they understand that that does not mean that they are
It doesn't mean anything. In fact, these days, and, you know, it used to be that you were guaranteed health care. You just go into any hospital. The Hippocratic Oath prevents them from turning you away. They will fix you, and then they will send you a huge bill, and then you will declare bankruptcy, and it'll be over. You're going to start over again. But then health insurance comes along, and it's like, okay, now you're not going to declare bankruptcy.
You invest on your own body.
Yeah. Yeah. Now somebody else, you're gambling, saying, okay, I'm going to give you a couple $100 a month, and you're going to take the risk. You're going to gamble on me by running your actuarial tables based upon my lifestyle and my family history, and my next thing you know, it's going to be my genome sequence. What illnesses could, you know, you're going to be, that's almost like witchcraft, you know. We're going to run your actuarial tables and pick your skin and do a blood sample, and we're going to map out your genome and decide what could happen to this guy. We're going to, you know, read the tea leaves, run the chicken bones over the tea leaves and try and figure out what's going to happen to this guy and make a bet placed upon that and say, okay, you pay us $400 a month, and when you get sick, because we know you will, because we've read your tea leaves, we'll cover it. And hopefully it doesn't happen sooner rather than later.
Well, now it's just kind of this, it's been a losing battle, right? Because while you have this side of the coin, you have the other side that we're like one of the most unhealthy countries, you know,
Mhm.
our obesity rate and diabetes and all these illnesses, people eating a bunch of garbage all the time and not taking care of themselves. And,
Yeah.
and so it's, the insurance companies have become more invasive in your lifestyle
Sure.
to try to get you to take preventive action because it's
It's costing
us
them
a lot of
money.
money.
Absolutely.
So, I mean, the kind of reports these companies pull on people and the money that they give healthcare providers to ensure they're doing the correct follow-ups and putting people on a plan and
Yep.
asking the right questions and pushing
Yeah.
them to the right specialists.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
They're kicking a lot of money out to try to keep people healthy.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's real easy to see that health is a big thing for people, and health insurance is a big thing for people. And now, with the size of the deductibles, you know, you got a deductible that's $12,000, $13,000, $14,000. You know, if you've got some money socked away in a 401k or something, you can pull out some money and cover your deductible. But that's a good chunk of money. It's a good chunk of money to pay that deductible in case something happens. But we definitely are putting a lot of faith in our money and in our health, in our health care, in our government, in the United States itself. One of the other things that occurs to me is that we put a lot of faith in ourselves. And I often wondered, there's a lot of scripture references about people worshiping the works of their hands. And you always, the natural inclination when you read that, and it's mentioned several times in the prophets, it's like worshiping the works of your hands, that you think, oh, well, that means somebody builds something with their hands, an idol, you know, and they're worshiping something that they built with their hands. But think about it another way, perhaps. You know, worshiping the works of your hands might be worshiping your job, worshiping your ability to do your job. I mean, you know that a man is basically identifies with his work. You are what you do for a living. And I think that we can often feel, you know, really insecure and uncomfortable, fear of the unknown again, if we're, you know, having financial difficulties or if we're not sure what our you know, vocation is going to be. You know, you might be thinking about a certain young man, you know, who's like 24 years old, who's doesn't have his life figured out yet and doesn't know what he's going to do for a job, and that is a existential crisis. You know, that's a really challenging subject. So worshiping ourselves, our intellect, our abilities, our looks, our talents might be worshiping the works of our hands. So a self-worship is basically, essentially at its root, that's Satanism. Straight, clear. Worship of self is Satanism.
Which is now so normal.
That's incredibly normal.
If you listen to people's conversation and you know, the typical movement from I want to get better and I will improve myself, my self-esteem and all those type of things.
I will seat myself in the mountain
And
of
these
God.
are the same things that we saw the phrasing from Solomon, right?
Yeah.
Look what I have built.
Yeah,
These
absolutely.
things that I have done.
Yeah, yeah.
It's funny if you have a conversation with people and you say, well, actually, you should not do that. You should almost be nothing. Try to be nothing.
Try to be humble.
What does he want us to be? But if you say that even to a certain Christian community, they just look at you and that's ridiculous.
That's a weird idea.
Or,
I know.
or just simply giving him the credit for placing you where you're at, right? Giving you the capacity to be able to understand things or do a good job at work.
Yep, absolutely. We can attribute a lot of things to ourselves if we are uncertain about the source of where all of our blessings come from. We will arrogate to ourselves all of the glory.
That's stealing.
It's stealing. That's exactly what it is. That's exactly what Adam and Eve were guilty of when they took the tree. So yes, we're stealing God's glory, and we know for a fact that he does not share his glory with any other. And that if we steal his glory, he is sure to take it back. And you know what happens when God takes his glory back? You get knocked down. And it's not usually fun. So yeah, there's a huge, one of the other ones that occurs to me, and which is a really powerful one, is children. We can definitely fall into the trap of worshiping our children, placing a tremendous amount of importance upon our children. We can get torn up. I've seen it over and over and over and over and over. I mean, it could very well happen to me. My children are not quite old enough to begin to rebel, to cause me to freak out.
You have to go back to what you fear, and my biggest fear is losing my children. So I would say they are right now at the top
Sure.
of what guides my actions.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
It's that fear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. But like I said,
I
there's...
fear that more than I fear God.
yeah,
And I know that's the wrong order.
I
That's
understand.
the honest truth.
Yeah, believe me, I feel the same way. Hello, there's one of my sons now. Yeah.
He's still here.
Uh-huh. So, I mean, they're young enough right now where they haven't begun to, rebel or anything. But that's the hardest thing for a parent, really, is when your child becomes old enough to begin making their own decisions, and they begin to make decisions that you don't want them to make. And you fear like the dickens that they are going off into the world. They're going to reject your God. They're going to reject your values. They're going to go the way of the world. They're going to do the things of the world, and their souls are going to be lost. They're going to die. They're going to be killed. They're going to be raped and pillaged, and God knows what else. All of those terrible thoughts going through your mind. That's horrible stuff. But
I just always picture her as 5 years old and always living with me and living in the house. Is that wrong to do?
I can see where this is headed. Your daughter's never leaving your house. No, I know. And I think, yeah, believe me, I know.
Not until Hayden's plan of coming in the middle of the night with his friends on horses or whatever that plan was.
Believe me, I know, buddy. Believe me, I know. So that's something that a lot of us need to, work on. I mean, I know, Chris, you're a fairly old fellow. You got kids who are retirement age, but I'm sure you still worry about your kids. Of course, man. It's a powerful, powerful thing. But we need to make sure that it's in perspective and remember that God gave us children. God gave us these children. They're His. They're not mine. This is a lend-lease program. Here, I want you to watch these for a little while. It's like if your neighbor, it's like John loaning me his Sennheiser wireless microphones. Alan, I'm going to loan these to you, but keep good care of them because I'm going to want them back. And you know what? I got to keep in mind, these are not mine. John has been gracious to me and let me use them. I enjoy the use of them. They're fabulous things, and I appreciate you.
You could view your money and your talents that way too.
Yeah, you absolutely should, and your health and your life. Begin to view it in that way. Thank you for entrusting this to me for a little while, because you may decide to take it away from me at some point, and I have to be okay with that, because you're the boss and I'm not, and you know what's awesome and what is working out perfectly according to your preconceived plan that you have, which I have no idea. I don't have the wisdom of God. I don't have foresight and foreknowledge and see the future and how everything. But I do know, and I know that you guys have seen this too in your lives, when you look back on some thing, some tragedy, some bad thing in your life, you look back on that later and you say, man, that just worked out somehow. I don't know how. I didn't know how at the time. It seemed like a terrible tragedy at the time, but it just came back together somehow. That's the power of your God that can work through even the most challenging circumstances to teach you things or cause you to grow in some way. I don't know, but it has definitely worked that way in my life. It's been pretty rare that something bad or tragic or challenging has happened where I've just been dumbfounded even later, still dumbfounded about why that happened. I don't even know that I can think of a time that that's happened. I can honestly say that the challenging things in my life, I have been able, in hindsight, at least after who knows how much time, to be able to look at that and say, I can see at least the beginnings of something that was going on there. It's the amazing providence of our God, that He's ruling all things according to His will, and that everything is good for those who love Him and are called according to His purpose. Consider it all joy when you encounter various trials. So that's a huge, huge thing for us, is to learn about fear and to have God be our shield. There's some good scriptures that I recommend that you, in your time, maybe to encourage your own heart and to continuously remind yourself about God being in control of everything and being your shield, that you look up scriptures about God being the shield. There's a decent number of them in the Psalms and the Proverbs about God being a shield. What do you think this metaphor means about God being your shield? Let me first say, if God says that He is a shield to Abram, can you then say that God is my shield? Can you take that promise for yourself? Is that legitimate?
Yeah, you see.
Why would you say that's legitimate?
I think it's only legitimate if you're following after God's word, right?
Well, that's an interesting thing, and I would suggest that, it's kind of interesting. Look, if you will, at Psalm 18, verse 30. Because I did actually want us to take a look at, because there are definitely some scriptures which talk about God being your shield. But it does actually seem to be conditional. I would say the first condition is, if you are of the seed of Abram, you inherit the promises of Abram, right? So if you are grafted into it of the spiritual house, okay, that would be prerequisite number one. You've got to be a member of Abram's family in order to receive the promises that were, passed on to Abram. But then when you look at Psalm 18, verse 30, talking about Him being your shield, what does it say there? Does that seem conditional to you? It certainly does. He is a shield to all who take refuge in Him.
So you have to stay behind the shield.
You gotta get. That's a great
Shield
insight.
doesn't do any good if you're in front of it.
That's a great point. Your shield does not do any good unless you are behind it.
Rule number one of the shield.
Well, I think that's like, there's places where it kind of talks about the Torah being this hedge of protection.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that, yes, number one, you have to be a member of the family of Abram if you're going to try and take this promise for yourself. And number two, many of these other scriptures about that being, God being a shield, there do seem to be some prerequisites here, and one of them is take refuge behind it. You got to get behind that shield, or it's not going to do anything for you. In 2 Samuel 22, verse 31, is you've got the same thing. His way is perfect. The word of Yehovah is proven. He is a shield to all who take refuge in Him. So it's repeated again. And then in Proverbs 2, 7 is a third example. Look at this one. In Proverbs 2, verse 7, it says, "And He, God, treasures up stability for the straight, a shield to those walking blamelessly." So those who are walking in the footsteps of Abraham, He is their shield. So yes, we can, I think, pretty clearly count on God to be our shield if we'll get behind it, if we'll walk blamelessly. Now, you know that if we sin and we flagrantly disobey the instructions of God, that judgment comes. just the law of sowing and reaping, karma, whatever you want to call it. I mean, it's put into place for a good reason. And so, yeah, if you're not walking blamelessly, you couldn't really say that God is your shield. You might have some trouble there.
I think that these conditional statements are all over the place for how God dwells with us.
Yeah.
Or in the tabernacle, or in the temple, or in John 14 when it talks about him going to prepare a place.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really this place that's in us, because the whole chapter talks about the Spirit coming to be with us. He's going to leave, the Spirit's going to come, and him and his Father are one.
Right.
Right? But they're all conditional statements that if you do this,
if you abide in me,
will do this,
right.
will abide,
Right. Yeah, that's a great point. It's something that we have, many of us have really overlooked in our Christian walk, is just putting all of our eggs into the basket of, I believe that Jesus is the Messiah. Great. That is a great starting block. You can't start from any other block. But that's a starting block. That's not the finish line.
Well, can we look at this word that, I don't know if we're jumping too far ahead, it's, I think, verse 6. But and he believed in Jehovah, and he was counted to him righteousness.
That is a big jump. I know it doesn't seem like it, but it is. No, I'm totally. What do you want to say about that?
Well, I think that this word believe is a great word picture.
Emunah? Is that what it is?
Amen, right?
Yeah, amen.
And it's
So let it be written. So let it be done.
That's right. And it's the Aleph, the Mem, and the Nun. Like, God's water is life. God's word is life.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
That's the belief.
Absolutely.
That's what saves your life.
Yeah. It's interesting too that I think that emunah, amen, and emet are all connected. Like the first Hebrew letter, the last Hebrew letter, and the middle Hebrew letter form together truth.
Mm-hmm.
Emet. And then amen, which is, I always say, so let it be written, so let it be done. So shall it be, affirming strongly. And faith, emunah. All three were, very closely related. Yeah. That's great stuff. Absolutely.
Is that the same word then, that when we say amen, amen, or amen?
Mm-hmm.
It's interesting because the terror he has in the dream is Emma.
Mm.
And the only difference is the hey at the end.
Right.
So God's word revealed.
Right. And God's revealed word here is kind of terrifying in this context. Yeah. That's a great insight, Mike.
Can I skip backwards?
Please. Yeah, absolutely.
We probably go to the next one, but I want to ask about vision.
Okay.
And because there are different ways that it always talks for, and of course farther also talks about that, the deep sleep, or here first it starts with a vision. How do you envision the vision?
This vision?
Yeah, that he is kind of sleeping, or is this Yahweh puts him in a state or directly talks to him? Sometimes it seems like
that is a good question, which I couldn't really answer. I know that some scholars have suggested that from the time that he the word, from the time that it says the word of Yehovah came to him, it actually doesn't say, and in fact I don't think in the Torah anywhere, in the writings of the prophets or anything, whenever it says the word of God came to somebody, it doesn't mean that they heard it. It's like it literally says the word of God happened to them as some kind of an event. It's a big event, a life-changing event. And that it's a really powerful thing, which it's described as maybe an ecstatic state, being some kind of in a dream trance, I don't really
With
know.
the prophets, doesn't it actually say when it's in a dream?
Yeah, sometimes it says that it came to him in a dream or in a vision, but a lot of times it just says the word of the Lord came to so and so the prophet and said.
Plainly, almost plainly, that they could understand what
Yeah.
he wanted or
Right,
heard.
right. But it basically, you got to look at that one scripture. I think it's in Deuteronomy. I could be wrong, where it says that, not so with Moses, my prophet. I spoke with him as a man speaks to his friend face to face, but with all the other prophets, I speak in visions, the obscurity, and it's not terribly clear. So I don't know. Some people have suggested that none of this actually happened. Abram did not literally get up and go find some animals and cut them and lay them
I
aside.
thought about it first, but then again, if you read it a few times, almost it sounds then he says, okay, go do this, and then it almost sounds okay, now he does what he needs to do.
Well,
then
and
he goes away.
I think that when you look at what happened here, I don't think that this just happened in a vision. I think that this literally happened, that he literally did get some animals and cut them and lay them aside, because this is covenant language, which is really powerful stuff. And if it's all happening in Abram's mind, it loses some of its power. I wouldn't say it's powerless, but I would say it loses some of its significance and some of its power if it's just all in his mind and that he's just having a vision of all of this stuff. Because I think it's too significant that Abram would have no. It's also significant that Abraham would have no part in actually doing any of it. But it's also significant if he did have a part in it and did some of it, did something, because that's always the way of God, is that he says, I will do the heavy lifting. I will do this. And it's always the big part, But I require you to do this.
Like Noah.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to destroy this place, and I desire you to get off your butt and start building something. Or Abram, I want you to leave your father's house and your land and your relatives and get up and leave. He tells him, I'm going to do thus and such and this, and those are the big things that you really can't do anything about, but I want you to do this. So to me, if all of this happens to Abram in his mind in some type of a trance or a vision, then it loses some of its power. And then again, you could make a case for it either way, but I like to see this actually happening for whatever reason. Take it or leave it. But let me, and I'm going to get there into more detail in just a sec. I want to ask you about, he says, do not be afraid, I am your shield. So we've discussed fear and the shield. Reward is exceedingly great. Still in verse 1, sorry, Mike. No, this Hebrew word for reward is actually not like, what do you think of when you see the word reward? Like you won the lottery, or you've been awarded something, you didn't do anything, you just bam, it happens, That is not what this Hebrew word means. This word is better translated as a wage. What your wages are great. Now, what do you think that means? Why does it say, what is the difference? Your reward is great versus your wages are great.
The wage you have to work.
Yeah.
And he had to show that he had to earn righteousness. And
He had to do something.
And walk with Yahweh the whole time.
Right. Now, we have this statement coming up here in just a second. We'll definitely want to deal with that. It says that he believed in Yahweh and he counted it to him as righteousness. But this wage is seemingly about something else, not just his faith, for sure, but definitely a big part of it. It was counted to him as righteousness, but we'll deal with that in just a sec. So I think that we need to really think about this reward in context is notably and actually a payment for services rendered. This is the way of our works. Our works that we do in this life do indeed reap wages. Yeshua says he's bringing with him the reward for what we've done, not what we've believed. So it says that a couple of times. I'm going to repay every man according to what he's done. So we have to act in righteousness and not just believe something. I know we keep harping on that, but
He just got done telling the king of Sodom, keep your stuff.
How does that relate?
Well, the very next thing is God saying to him, your wages will be great. And here he just prior to that, for,
He rejects some wages,
yes, he rejected Sodom's.
the wages of the earth.
Yeah.
Sure.
Just wanted the people.
That's a great insight, yes. He just rejected wages that would have been paid to him in temporal dividends and instead holds out for the spiritual dividends. It's a good insight. I like that.
Especially when it says after these things.
Yeah, so
Start with
that
that.
makes you want to look and see
Yeah.
after what things.
Mm-hmm.
And that's like the first little stanza there that he says to him, your wages shall be great. He just got done dealing with that.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I wanted to review briefly regarding the promises that God had made previous to this, because here we get started into dealing with Abram's faith and why it was counted to him as righteousness and what is going on here that he is suddenly brought outside and looks towards the heavens and such. If you examine, for example, just maybe make a note of it, in Genesis chapter 12, verses 3 and 7, God says, I will make you a great nation, and to your seed I give this land. Did Abram not believe God before, but he does now, and it's been counted as righteousness for some reason in this situation? What has changed? What is the difference? He says, and behold, in these promises, he says, what are you going to give me? What reward can I get? I don't have any children. I'm already fabulously wealthy. I don't need anything else. I need children. And then he's like, no. Don't worry about Eliezer of Damascus. He's not going to be your heir. Son of your own body is going to be your heir. He shows him the heavens and shows him the stars and says, this is what your seed is going to be like. And he believed, and he reckoned it to him for righteousness. Why now does he believe and it's reckoned to him as righteousness? And why not before? Did he not believe when God said, go and walk the rest of the land and your children will be like dust, like the sand on the seashore or the dust of the earth, What has changed? Why has he suddenly believed God and he didn't before? Or did he believe before?
Yeah, can you explain where he didn't believe before?
Well, I'm just curious about why God reiterates the promise and he believed in Yehovah and he reckoned it to him for righteousness. Why didn't it say, if he appeared to him in some way, shape, or form and said, I want you to leave your father's house and your land and your relatives, and he did, he acted in faith and he believed God. I believed in God, at least, enough to realize he wasn't just hearing voices, and he followed the instructions. Why wasn't it reckoned to him as righteousness then? Okay, when God said in chapter 12, verses 3 and 7, I make a great nation out of you, and your reward, I will bless those who bless you and curse those who curse you, and all those other things. And he says, to your seed I'm going to give this land, back in Genesis 12. Why doesn't it say that his faith was great and it was counted to him righteousness then? What has happened here? Why is it different here? It's not saying that he didn't believe in him, but why now is something different? Has the promise changed? Has Abram's attitude changed? Why is it here accounted to him as righteousness that he believed? Did he not believe before? Did he not believe enough? Does his faith take a great leap here, and suddenly he is counted to him for righteousness? I'm just asking you, what is the difference here? What has changed that he believes now?
Traditional view, but I don't believe in that, because it's almost like after that about the land he doesn't believe, and then a covenant has to be made.
So what do you suggest, or what do you think the traditional view is?
I heard the traditional view that they say in the first part, he believes, okay, I believe you, and he's being counted righteous. And then the second time, he doesn't believe it, or doesn't say that he really believes it. So then he has to kill animals.
Oh.
Yeah, that's the traditional.
I got you. It's because of the animals that he now believes. I got
That
you.
won't make sense. That's what you're saying in chapter 12.
Yeah. Yeah, that doesn't line up, does it? Okay. So do you have any other ideas?
What does righteousness mean?
Tzedakah.
Yeah, what does that mean?
Well, that's a great question. He counted it to him as righteousness. Well, I would say from a traditional sense and from my own mind, that's all I could give you. I don't know that I would be able to give you a biblical definition of righteousness, although I would say, following the commandments, doing what God says makes you a righteous person. Or tzedakah could also be translated as charity, giving money or time or resources to the poor. Those two words mean the same thing. Do you have a formal definition for tzedakah?
I don't know if it is the correct one, but it talks again about almost like faith, which I kind of find interesting, because faith has then also in the morality, virtue.
Behaving in a virtuous fashion somehow?
BDB has righteousness, judge of law, righteous acts.
Well,
Truthfulness.
we know that Yeshua said the one who behaves righteously is righteous, right? So I would say you might want to, if you use some religious jargon, it might help you to think right standing. I have nothing against you. I consider that to be good behavior. That is commendable. Does that help you to formulate the answer to the previous question?
No.
Posit a theory.
And does speculation in the next chapter even prove that this...
What do you want to speculate about in the
Well,
next
'cause I
chapter?
mean, the next thing we're running into Hagar, so did you really believe this was going to happen?
Well, I looked at that because nowhere does it say Sarai is going to have a child. So I'm not excusing Abram in the next chapter.
Yeah, it says come forth from your own body.
From you, and that's also a curious phraseology because usually when it talks about children, it says from your loins or from your seed or something like that. But this one,
It's the
I had an
later
idea about
chapters
that.
that's from Sarah
yeah,
that he says
yeah.
that.
What
I said I had an idea about that.
about what?
Why it was phrased weird.
Oh,
Come forth from your own body.
what do you think?
Well, there's this, you were referring back to chapter 12. Before, when you talked to him, he told him that, didn't you bring that up last week? First time he says, count the sand of the sea or whatever. And the second time it's the stars of the sky.
In chapter.
There's that whole contrast between the physical and the spiritual.
Yeah, yeah,
Just
absolutely.
like Joseph's dreams.
Right.
It's one with the wheat,
One in the
sheaves,
field and one- yeah.
in the field, in
Uh-huh.
the world. The field is the world. And then one with the stars that hasn't even happened yet.
Right.
Because the mother
Yep.
wasn't even there at that time to do
Right.
that, so that hasn't happened yet. So have we moved into something that is bigger than just the physical descendants and the physical land, and that's why he's using this weird phrase, from your own body, and
Yeah.
having him look at the stars,
Yes.
and now we're going into this weird thing with this covenant, and we have just some strange things happening.
No, I fully agree. Yes, there is something more significant going on here when we're dealing with terrestrial things. And I mean, if he says, go and walk through the land and explore it, and your children will be like the dust. Well, he can see the dust, and he can feel the dust, and he can go, how can you count this? But I can at least experience it on some level. But when he says, count the stars, that's so far beyond my reach. I can't go up out there and get closer to them. Who knows how many are out there I can't even see? It's so far away from him that he's asked to imagine beyond. And I think
And in the
that
future also.
yes,
Then you do have to make the leap to faith.
yes, and I think
Because you
that
are counting on something that you can't touch.
Yes, and I think that if you take that just a step further, that's why you suddenly have his faith counted to righteousness for him in this situation, but not previously. Because when God says to Abram, when he first meeting with God, he says, leave your father's house and your relatives and your nation. Well, that's challenging. It's hard to leave your father's house and your people and your relatives and your nation, but it's something that Abram could do. That, I think, is the difference. Here, he's telling him, your seed will be great. He's as good as dead. He's 100 years old, and this is what it tells us. And we read in the book of Galatians, you read in the book of Hebrew, you read in the book of James, he considered his own body now as good as dead in the deadness of Sarah's womb, and did not grow weak in faith. This is the difference, I think, is that before, when God spoke with Abram and had him do something or told him do this or do that, it was things that he was able to effectively do something with. Here, Abram can do nothing. There is absolutely nothing that Abram can do to take part in this promise, aside from know his wife. But this, I think, takes a greater amount of faith.
And what's about to happen with these animals, Abraham doesn't do the walking through part. He just does the splitting part, which is interesting because we saw splitting side to side. That's man, wife, God in the middle.
Yes.
And now we have, that's all he has to do is man, wife, and God does the walking through for him.
Yes.
So
It's a good insight. And I think it helps to prove the issue here is that why Abram's faith was counted to him as righteousness, because I think that this took great faith to actually firmly believe in his mind. I mean, that would be like saying, that God makes you a promise that to you is utterly inconceivable. Makes no sense at all. There's absolutely nothing that you could potentially do to influence the outcome. This is something that is entirely in the realm of God.
And in a way, you will be dead when everything like this plays out.
Sure. Yeah. So he has, and I think that it is worth maybe the idea that we look at this and we say, there is small faith and great faith. I mean, Yeshua was continuously talking about, well, not a ton, but quite a bit about tiny, tiny faith and great faith, and, comparing and contrasting. Man, you guys have no faith. If you had faith the size of a mustard seed, you'd have something. But I think that this is an example here in the life of Abram, that in this situation, he has to actually have a good size faith to believe this, because it's so far out of the realm of possibility for him, and it's also outside of what he's even able to conceive of.
It might be a stretch here, but in the verse where it talks about from his own body, from your own body.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So there's a bunch of scripture in the New Testament that talks about how your body's not your own.
Right.
And
Right.
then the nakedness of the father,
Mm-hmm.
the man is his wife. So perhaps this is not referring to just him, but also Sarah.
Yeah, good point. Good point. That's a good insight. I like that. So do you see how this might be? We can kind of make maybe make a little bit of sense out of this this thing about Abram believing God, and it's suddenly accounted to him as righteousness, because it just took a great deal of faith that he has. I don't know how long Abram has been in fellowship with God, but it has apparently been some time. We know that when he left his father's house in Haran, that he had been walking with God for some amount of time, because he already had souls that he had made and he was following the Word of God. But now I think in the next chapter it says that from the time that he left his father's house in Haran and went to the Promised Land, it's been 10 years. So it's not a terrible long time, but he had previously had known about God and had some kind of relationship with God prior to coming to the Promised Land. So he's got some experience under his belt. He's become an old man. I think he's 99 years old at this point. How old does he live to be? Wasn't it like 100 and...
Well, he hit I think it says 99 when he hits chapter 17, right?
Yeah. I think he lives to be 100 and... Is it 150? I'd have to check that. I mean, remember that Sarai is going to die in a little while after the Akedah. And Abram remarries and has a whole boatload of children from another wife, Keturah. So he's still kicking.
And then in chapter 20, when he tries to give Sarah up again the second time, she was 90, so he's 100 there, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, no, he would have been like 110 or something. I think he's like 10 or 15 years older than her. Is it? Okay. Yeah, I don't know how old I don't know how old he is when he dies. That's something you could probably Google. But in any event, he is getting old, and he has to absolutely trust in God to fulfill this promise, and it takes great faith. And I think Angie and you guys have already kind of discussed that God telling Abraham his seed will be like the sand in chapter 13, and then here the stars in chapter 15. I wanted to ask a question that is very similar to that, but brings in an additional element, which is kind of curious. Why does God tell Abram that his seed will be like sand in chapter 13, and here says as the stars, and why is each somehow related to Lot? Did you notice that both of these promises regarding seed is somehow related to Lot? The first time he's hanging out with Lot, and they go down to Egypt, and then they come back after the fiasco in Egypt. He separates from Lot, and God appears to him and says, your seed like sand of the sea, dust of the earth. Then, a little bit later, he goes and rescues Lot from the destruction and the being captured by these 4 kings. And then when he gets back from that happening, he has promised that his seed will be like the stars of the heavens. So yes, there's something going on in a spiritual sense, because we've got earthly things and celestial things. That we need to explore maybe a little bit more. But how is this somehow, why is Lot involved in both of these things? I see somehow that Lot is involved here. Because it's like the first time he separates himself from Lot, and suddenly, and we talked about that when we studied him and Lot, and it was like, okay, he was maybe on the wrong path, and maybe he needed to be separated from Lot, because as soon as he's separated from Lot, it's like God appears to him again all of a sudden and gives him these great promises. And then he goes and rescues Lot, and God appears and makes an even bigger, grander promise, and even strikes up a covenant, and really things start really getting, kicked off here. Just curious about the juxtaposition of Lot in this story.
Well, then he's hanging out with God while they're saving Lot again, right? Yes, absolutely. Another big revelation is like, should I hide from Abram what I'm about to do? Why would I do that? It's like Abram's my friend. I'm going to share with Abram what's going on here. And that's an excellent point. When he's about to bring judgment down on a whole group of cities and destroy a whole bunch of people, he basically says, should I reveal this to my friend Abram? And there's Lot again, right in the middle of that story. It seems like every time, I don't know if it's every time, it might be something to look into, but it seems like whenever there's a big revelation of God, somehow Lot's involved.
What does Lot mean, actually?
Yeah.
That is a great question. I have forgotten what Lot.
Oh, wait, I got it.
You got it?
Covering.
Covering?
Interesting. Covering, yeah.
That's interesting. That is interesting. I don't know what that, you could probably run crazy with that for a few minutes.
The covering, is that not also in a way a covenant?
Atonement would be a covering.
Oh, okay.
This is more like a veil.
A veil. Okay. That's interesting in itself. I don't know what you would make of
Seems
that.
like Abraham's the go-between, almost like an advocate or something.
Yeah.
Lot, you know, like he's, I don't know.
Something to think about. I don't know that I have the answers for that, but I do suggest to you that there's something there, and it might bear, a little bit deeper study to kind of figure out what is going on with Abram and Lot, because there's something happening there. I don't know exactly what it is, and we're in several places in the New Testament writings told to remember Lot, but we look back at Lot and we say, what a doofus. Something's wrong with this guy.
Yet Lot's kind of us, isn't
He is kind of us. Yes, that is a
He gotta be
great...
rescued and then go running right back
Yeah.
to Sodom, and
I'm
we're called righteous, but really we're a bunch of doofuses. I mean, really we are Lot.
and that reminds me that they say, remember, that when we read about Noah, that he was righteous in his generations, and that is sometimes interpreted as righteous for his time. Not if he had lived in the days of Abram, he would not really have been considered a terribly righteous individual, but for the days that he lived in, he just stood out like a sore thumb.
Relatively righteous.
Relatively righteous. And the same thing might be said about Lot, that for the days in which he lived, in the cities in which he lived amongst, he may have stood out like a serious sore thumb. And boy, that is encouraging to me, because in the days in which we live in, I may really desire to be like Lot or Abraham, or not Abraham, but Noah, as a righteous, relatively righteous. I don't want to be that, but it's good that God is gracious and sees in Lot something worthy of being rescued, and in Noah, not quite to that extent, but you see what I'm saying. But in relation to this thing about Lot being somehow involved here, and Mike brought up, excellent point that when Sodom and Gomorrah are about to be destroyed, there's Lot again. What I had in my notes here is that this might suggest that God will only reveal His glory to us if we are willing to separate from things that are not aligned with our path, like when He separates from Lot the first time. The ones we have separated from things that we shouldn't be involved with, or people maybe that we shouldn't be involved with, that He will, kind of get closer to us once we have kind of separated from things that are maybe not good in our lives, perhaps, whether it's people or something else. And that once we have done this, if we then move to, it's almost like Abram separated himself from Lot because Lot was on a bad path and he did not want to associate with him further, and that God honored that. But then you see that Abram acted to save him. He actually brought salvation to Lot, and that God honored that even more. You know what I'm saying? It's a weird conundrum. It's a weird dichotomy, if you will, but it seems somehow that Lot is related here, and I'm not exactly sure how, but that was the only thing I could think of, is that maybe the first time he needed to separate from Lot in order for God to take him to another level, and then once he was at that level, he was able to actually rescue Lot, become a certain type of salvation for Lot in rescuing him from the slavery of being, taken captive by these kings, and that he moved into a new position because of that. So I'm not really sure, but I would encourage you to look at that.
It's interesting, though, that the negotiation that he does with God for Sodom, that Lot's not really mentioned in that negotiation. It's just
Right. Anybody you can find. Yeah. Yeah, he could have said, "Hey, what about my nephew Lot? You know, can we get him out of there?" But he went beyond that, and he didn't mention Lot by names, which is certainly curious. It makes me wonder if he's like, I don't even think I should bring up Lot at this point. It might be best if I just don't bring up Lot. I don't know. That's a good question. Yeah.
And then, you know, even though Lot did all the weird stuff he did, he still gets worked into the lineage of Messiah.
Yeah, that's very true. Very true. Excellent point. So there's something very mysterious about Lot. I'm going to end with this this question from Abram in verse 8. He says, "Hey man, this is so your seed going to be, look toward the heaven and count the stars." And then he said, "Master Yehuvah, how am I assured that I shall possess it?" Well, what is the it? It seems to be a reference to look now towards the heavens and count the stars if you're able to count them. And he said, "So are your seed." And he believed. And he said to him, "I am Yehuvah who brought you out of Ur-Kasdim to give you this land to inherit it." And then he says, "How am I to be assured that I shall possess it?" What is the it? The seed or the land?
The land.
It seems to be talking about the land. But how do you interpret this question? What is he actually saying with this question? The construction of the Hebrew for this question is slightly odd. The Hebrew text seems to say, we have Master Yehuvah, how am I assured that I shall possess it? That's a fairly lengthy statement, but I think in Hebrew there's only 4 words there. And you might better render it literally as, with what can I be assured? With what can I be assured? What do you think he's asking about? Is he...
Some sort of proof.
That's kind of what I was looking at it as. Is he seems to be seeking assurance or a sign, maybe of some kind?
I get the feeling like he wants to know how to tell when it's all been accomplished.
Okay.
And so then he goes into this lengthy thing about we're going to have the 400 years of this, and you're going to die in your ripe old age. In other words,
Okay, now hold on a second, because when he asks this question, how shall I know these things? How does God answer the question?
well, he tells him
Go get some animals.
Uh-huh.
Is that an answer to the question? I think it is. But we don't have time to go into that this time. So I would just say keep on your mind and on your plate this question that he asks in verse 8 that might literally be translated, with what can I be assured? And God seemingly answering his question by cutting a blood covenant with him. How does that answer his question? And what is this blood covenant? I would suggest to you, and I'll just put this up here, and if you want to take a note to yourself, there is a book that was published in 1885, just after the Civil War, called The Blood Covenant, A Primitive Rite and Its Bearings on Scripture, by Henry Clay Trumbull, Doctor of Divinity. And it is free online. It's not terribly long. And it is very, very interesting. That talks about this guy traveled all over the world, in Africa, in Northern Europe, in Asia, in the Middle East, and he was researching this blood covenant. In America, we might refer to it like something the Native Americans used to do, become blood brothers. You cut your thumb and you touch your blood together or something like that. That's the nearest thing that I'm aware of. But you know what? It's still a thing here in America. But this guy wrote this booklet, really. It's kind of like a booklet. It's not a great big thing. But I would highly recommend that you look at it, skim it, take a look at it. You can find it at the some of these virtual libraries, Ethereal Classics online virtual library. It is easy to find, and it will give you a tremendous amount of insight into this next section that we're going to be reading regarding the striking of a blood covenant. Very interesting stuff. So I'll leave you with that, and then we'll get back here together next time to look at this blood covenant.
So we're gonna still be on this chapter next.
Yes. Is that okay?
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that I wasn't speaking too soon.
Yes. Yeah, I think we got a little bit more time in this chapter. I hadn't really anticipated that, but it turns out to be so. Anyway, let us pray.